So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the notion of linguistic relativity, and I'm going to talk in broad terms about that, and then later on I'm going to look at linguistic relativity and food. So we tend to talk about two notions of linguistic relativity, a strong and a weak version. Sapir-Whorf are the two linguists who lent their names to the particular hypothesis of the strong version of linguistic relativity. And what that says, what that claims, is the language one habitually uses influences the manner in which one thinks and behaves. So we learn our language, our native language, and that shapes the way that we see the world and the way that we behave in the world. That particular hypothesis has had a lot of resistance in the last 30 years or so. And for a long time, the prevalent view was a much weaker notion of linguistic relativity, that language is a reflection of our cultural preoccupations and constrains the way that people think. So it's not that the language actually determines the way we think, but it constrains it. We can think in other ways, but that's the way that we behave, constrained by the language. And that's a reflection of what is important in society. And at the same time, context is just as important as language in understanding meaning. So it's not that we only go with language as an explanation of what is being communicated, but we integrate the context, and it's an interaction between the linguistic message and the contextual message or non-verbal message. Recently, there's been a renewed interest in linguistic relativity and that of that stronger Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And one of the linguists who's been responsible for this reawakening, this resurgence of interest in a strong linguistic relativity view, is a young linguist called Lera Boroditsky. And she was at Stanford. She's recently moved to University of California, San Diego. And if you go to her homepage, all her papers have links. There's a link to every one of her papers. It's a great homepage, great resource. And what her particular body of work has been aiming at is to provide empirical support for the notion of linguistic relativity. And I'm going to talk about a couple of her particular experiments in terms of linguistic relativity. The first one we're going to talk about is a particular community in Northern Australia, an Aboriginal group. What Boroditsky is interested in looking at here is the effect of language on the conceptualization of space and time. Okay, so we can conceptualize space in three particular ways. We can use cardinal directions. That's an absolute conception of space. So we're thinking in terms of north, south, east, west. We don't often say things like, move the cup to the north, northwest a little bit, okay? That's not how we conceptualize language in everyday use. Although, if you're in the military, you probably would use this kind of absolute notion of space. Second, there's an intrinsic notion of space. For example, Michelle is standing on her husband's left, okay? And we also have stage left and stage right as you're looking out at the audience. These are fixed. They're intrinsic to a particular object, okay? So Michelle's husband, his left is always going to be his left, okay? So if Michelle is standing on his left, it doesn't matter which way they turn, she's always on the left. And that's an intrinsic notion of space. Finally, we have relative. Um, and this is more of a what we call a deictic reference. So for example, coming from Columbus, OU is on the right of 33, yeah? Yeah. But coming from Pomeroy, it's on the left, okay? So it's relative to the particular context, okay? And if you see a note on my office saying back in 10 minutes, what does that mean? Because you don't know when I left the office. And so that's relative, but it has no point of reference to be able to know when those 10 minutes is up. Okay, so we tend to use, in everyday English, we use intrinsic, but we also use a lot of relative conceptions of space. Getting back to this Australian communities, Aboriginal community, what we know is that they think differently about space, Boroditsky wants to know if we can go from space to time. So do they also think differently about time? And so this is what she did in terms of an experiment. She had a set of photos which were showing a temporal progression. For example, she may have had pictures of somebody at various ages in terms of being a baby, being a toddler, being a teenager, etc., etc. So the cards were picturing a temporal flow, okay, a temporal progression. And then what she did was she shuffled the photos and asked her participants to order the particular cards temporally. Okay, and so when you order something temporally, there's a relationship with the spatial dimensions you're going to use. So if you think about that in terms of English, okay, if you're looking at a pack of cards which have a temporal progression in terms of the story or the images, then the earliest one is going to go on the left, and the next one is going to go next to that to the right. Okay, because we conceive of time in English as moving from left to right. Okay? In other cultures, other languages, for example, Hebrew, you would conceive of time as being going right to left, depending on how we read. What's interesting about this particular group is that they conceive of time as moving from east to west. So what happened in this experiment? Okay, well, depending on where the east and the west was, the cards were arranged according to that dimension, not to left to right or right to left, but according to east to west. So if I'm sitting facing the north and I'm going to arrange those cards by east to west, then the first card goes to the right, and then the next card goes to the left of that, and the next card goes to the left of that, going towards the west. Okay? If I'm sitting differently, if I'm sitting facing the south, all right, then the first card is going to go on the left, and then the next card is going to go to the right of that, etc. If I'm facing the east, I'm going to arrange the cards not horizontally, but vertically. Okay, with the first card the furthest away from me, next card getting closer to me, okay, below the first card. Okay, and if you switch around the other way and you're facing the west, then the first card temporally, okay, is going to be closest to me. Okay, so here's a different way of conceiving of space and time. So it's probably not hard to um, guess that this particular group of uh, uh, in this community spend a lot of time in the particular bush of Australia. They are dependent on being able to find their way. And how do they do that? Well, they do that by understanding where east, west, north, and south is. And so these are fundamental, crucial aspects of how they get around and how they conceive of space. And that particular way of conceiving of space has been transferred to time. Okay, here's a little another experiment that Boroditsky did, and this is to do with gender, grammatical gender. And grammatical gender refers to the way that languages tend to use particular systems of classifying nouns according to male and female, masculine, feminine, I should say. And we'll look at that experiment in a minute. But just to get you in the mood for this, here's two bridges. The one on the left is the Queen Juliana Bridge, and the one on the right is the Benjamin Harrison Bridge. So if you look at the bridge on the left, our Queen Juliana Bridge, what I'd like you to do is just to write down a few adjectives describing it. Okay? And when you've got 3 or 4 adjectives, then switch your attention to the Benjamin Harrison Bridge. And again, see if you can write down a few adjectives. And you can pause now to allow yourself time to do that. It probably is not going to work, but it would be interesting to know whether the gender of the bridges, because I've given them a gender, right, by giving them a female and a male name, whether your adjectives reflected that distinction in terms of gender. So if you look at your list of adjectives, do you tend to find, and this is hard to determine, more feminine adjectives describing the Queen Juliana Bridge and more masculine adjectives describing the Benjamin Harrison Bridge? So that's an attempt to kind of imitate an experiment that Boroditsky did with grammatical gender. So what she had was a group of native speakers of Spanish and a group of native speakers of German, and they were asked for adjective to describe a bridge. Okay, this all happened in English. Okay, so in Spanish, bridge, puente, is masculine. In German, Brücke is feminine. Okay, so they arrive with these particular gender categories. What she found was that when she looked at the German speakers, the adjectives they tended to use were more feminine, and she used a control group to determine what were more feminine adjectives. So they tended to use words like beautiful, fragile, elegant, peaceful, and pretty, whereas the Spanish speakers, who in their language have the grammatical gender of masculine for bridge, tended to have more masculine adjectives: big, dangerous, long, strong, sturdy, and towering. So Boroditsky's done a lot of work on trying to see how our language affects and determines the way we think and conceive of the world. Let's see if we can transfer that to the language of food, and especially the language of senses. And here's a story. It happened in Britain. This story. It's a couple of years old, 3 years old. And it's a story about a man who lived for 10 years with a corpse hidden under the sofa. Yeah, it doesn't sound too pleasant, does it? Okay. Apart from keeping a corpse under the sofa, this was an upturned sofa, by the way, it also has this very interesting fact that this particular person's flat, apartment where they live, was visited twice by 2 people from the council, because there have been complaints about the smell in the apartment. So let's just read the story here. Neighbors had complained about hideous smells, but local authority officials failed to notice there was a decomposing body despite visiting twice. Alan Derrick had invited his homeless friend Dennis Pring, 73, to live with him in the mid-90s. But when Mr. Pring died suddenly, Mr. Derrick panicked because he feared he would be told to leave his sheltered flat. This was a flat, an apartment owned by the local authority or council, public housing. So instead of alerting the authorities, Mr. Derrick hid the body under an overturned sofa. A year after the death, a council warden inspected the flat after complaints of a terrible smell. Okay? So what happened? But she failed to notice the body and put the smell down to an overflowing toilet because there was a lot of garbage in the apartment as well. Okay? And apparently there were two visits, and so nobody was able to, of the people who visited the apartment, was able to distinguish the smell of rotting body from a smell of kind of rotting garbage and what was coming from the toilet. Okay, so putrescent flesh, great word, emits distinctive gases. Okay, and these we can call these cadaverine and putrescine, which are different than the methane of the toilet, of the latrine. So this particular visitor was not able to distinguish these gases, these odors, are the cadaverine and the putrescine from the methane of the latrine. Okay. Now you're probably wondering why there's a picture of a group of happy, smiling, healthy-looking Samoans at the bottom. In the Samoan language, there are actually specific verbs for the smell of a body. And the question is this: in a language like English, where we just have stink or stench or smell, which don't actually capture what type of stink or smell, does that dull our senses? Or put it another way, a Samoan council warden would have identified the smell correctly. Because Samoans distinguish smells based on whether they're cadaverine, putrescine, or methane. So they actually have verbs that actually refer to those distinct smells. Here's the question that Boroditsky would ask. If we, in English, had that kind of different lexical distinctions, would that body have been discovered a lot earlier? And Boroditsky would say, yes, it would, and conversely, therefore, here's the way that our language determines the way that we operate in the world, because we don't have those particular distinct words to capture those particular smells. We have lots of ways of describing it, but not a particular one lexeme, one verb that expresses that. Okay, so as it turns out, of course, we've looked at Samoan there. There are many languages throughout the world which have a far more sophisticated way of classifying particular things like smells. In the little language here called Jahai, which is known as an Aslian language, and those are spoken in the southern peninsula of Malaysia, in the middle there. There's a large particular category of specific smell verbs. And it's perhaps not surprising that these particular communities have kept, or they haven't been subjected to the kinds of urban and industrial influences that everyone else in the world has. And so they're, in a sense, their ancestry as rainforest foragers has perhaps been kind of maintained in the language of their smell verbs. It's also interesting as well that this particular group of language speakers, have a way of determining their relationship with the supernatural through the sense of olfaction. And that's not too far removed, if you think of it, from Western cultures, early Western cultures that where you had animal sacrifices where the smell of the sacrifice is really what is being communicated to the gods. The gods are not going to eat that delicious barbecue, but they can go, wow, that smells great. So if we have a look at these particular verbs, what we have is a very complex lexical elaboration of smell, and these are all stative verbs, okay? And on the left there, I've given you the approximate translations, and on the right is what they particularly describe. So you can see that in English we have a way of rendering it, but we render it in terms of the general word smell, or to have a smell, okay? And then we use an adjective. This particular language uses specific verbs, just one lexeme to capture that particular smell. So if you look down the list there, we have some specific smells in terms of cooked food, sweets, roasted food, flowers, perfumes, then we get to feces, rotten meat, etc. Old dwellings, mushrooms, stale food. In English we'd say, oh, it smells musty, but they actually have a verb to capture this. And then further on, human urine, and then I think we've got animal urine as well. We're distinguishing between lots of things there, all housed in one particular verb. Okay. We can also look at other languages in terms of about how they capture taste. So whereas that particular language of the Jahai was complex in terms of smell verbs, the Khoe languages are complex in terms of taste verbs. So we're looking now at Central Kalahari area in Botswana, and this particular study by Nakagawa looked at three very minor languages spoken in this area called the Khoe languages. That's Haba, and that little sign before the H there is a click, which I can't do, of course. So that's one of the click languages, and then so those other languages there too. And again, we have a particular group of language speakers that still have pretty close connections with their origins as hunter-gatherers. So what here we can see is a pretty sophisticated development, and that here we got 20 independent lexemes. You might find that a little bit difficult to see. You can also if you are full screen on that, you'll be able to pick that out. Notice the first one there, to have a good taste, typical of giraffe meat. That's a lot of words in English to express that, okay? It's housed in one word in these particular Khoe languages. And so as you can go on there, you can get these very specific taste verbs. There's also, in this particular language, a further development of that in terms of texture verbs. And again, these are verbs that capture the texture of the food as opposed to the taste. The texture is the way it feels in the mouth. Okay, and again, a huge, great, elaborate list of particular taste verbs. On the side there, it mentions the notion of idiophones. I'm going to talk about idiophones in the next lecture. And idiophones basically are ways that words have a kind of a relationship with what they're referring to in terms of, say, the way they look visually or the way they sound. And finally, let me look at one last study. Unfortunately, this last study has got a very small sample size. It only were 12 participants, 9 younger and 3 older participants. But it's an interesting idea. And what it's trying to look at is whether the lexicon of sense verbs has changed as society changes. Okay. So this was a study of the generational changes in the linguistic encoding of senses in Cantonese as spoken in Hong Kong and Macau. What it found was, or what it claimed to find, was older Cantonese speakers had a greater vocabulary for expressing the proximal senses. Proximal ones are the ones that are up close: taste, touch, smell. Okay? Whereas younger Cantonese speakers had a greater vocabulary for expressing distal senses: sight and sound. Okay? So think about that. Think about your own particular experiences. You probably spend a lot of time listening to music. You probably spend a lot of time looking at stuff on screens. And so those are the kinds of senses that are highly developed in our society, and probably the notions of taste, touch, and smell are much less defined. And we looked at smell in terms of the fact that that visitor couldn't determine whether it was the smell of a body or the smell of the toilet. So we can ask this question: is this a normal consequence of industrial economic development of a society? And again, going back to Boroditsky, what we can begin to see is that society changes and our language changes, then the language is also determining the way that future generations begin to see the world, to understand the world. And so very much we're talking about how language is determining the way we think and operate in the world.